D'Angelo Barksdale spends most of The Wire trapped between two different versions of himself. One version is the man the Barksdale organization wants him to be: loyal, quiet, willing to do what needs to be done, and never ask questions. The other version is the man we actually see throughout the show: thoughtful, uncomfortable with violence, and increasingly aware that the world around him is hollow. The reason his prison storyline matters so much is because it forces those two versions to collide. It also raises one of the biggest questions in the entire series. Was D'Angelo actually going to flip? A lot of people answer that question with complete certainty. Some say yes, he absolutely would have cooperated. Others say no, D'Angelo would never betray his family. The reality is more complicated, and that complexity is exactly why Stringer Bell ends up making one of the most important decisions in the show. The key thing to understand is that D'Angelo's story was never really about prison. It was about distance. Every season, he moves a little further away from the Barksdale organization emotionally, even when he remains physically inside it. At the start of the series, D'Angelo is already different from the people around him. He sells drugs. He benefits from the organization. He isn't innocent, but he also spends an unusual amount of time thinking about what he's doing. Most of the people around him focus on survival, money, power, or reputation. D'Angelo focuses on consequences. One of the best examples comes during the famous chess scene. While teaching the younger dealers how the game works, he explains the hierarchy of the organization. The kings stay protected. The pawns get sacrificed. The scene is remembered because it explains the drug trade, but it also explains D'Angelo himself. The difference is that D'Angelo actually notices the pawns. Most people in the organization accept the system. D'Angelo questions it. He notices Wallace. He notices Bodhi. He notices the people who end up dead. Every time somebody gets discarded, it leaves an impression on him. That becomes even more obvious after Wallace is murdered. Wallace's death changes D'Angelo in a way that never really heals. He may not know every detail of what happened, but he understands enough. Wallace was a kid. Wallace wanted out. Wallace ended up dead. The organization treats it as business. D'Angelo doesn't. That difference matters because from that point forward, he starts seeing the game less as a source of identity and more as a machine that destroys people. The problem for the Barksdales is that once somebody starts seeing the machine, it becomes difficult to make them believe in it again. Then prison enters the picture. When D'Angelo goes away, something important happens. For the first time in his life, the organization loses direct control over him. Outside prison, his family, his rank, his money, and his responsibilities constantly pull him back into the game. Inside prison, most of that disappears. He has time to think, and thinking is dangerous. The organization understands violence. It understands police investigations. It understands rival gangs. What it doesn't understand very well is reflection. D'Angelo spends months reflecting. The death that affects him the most is not Wallace's anymore. It's the death of people like Wallace. The endless cycle itself becomes the problem. Then comes the moment that changes everything. D'Angelo reads The Great Gatsby. It sounds almost ridiculous when you reduce it to that sentence. One of the most powerful drug organizations in Baltimore starts falling apart because a prisoner reads a novel. But that's exactly why The Wire is so good. The book doesn't magically transform D'Angelo. Instead, it gives language to feelings he already has. He starts discussing dreams, disappointment, class, and illusion. He starts seeing connections between Gatsby's world and his own. He starts recognizing that people can spend their entire lives chasing something that ultimately doesn't exist. For years, the organization told him that loyalty would mean something, family would mean something, the crown would mean something. Now, he isn't so sure. This is where many viewers begin to assume he was definitely going to flip. The evidence seems obvious. He becomes distant from Avon. He becomes distant from Stringer. He rejects opportunities to return to his old status. He openly criticizes the organization. Most importantly, he tells Donette that he wants a different life. Those are not the words of someone fully committed to the game. At the same time, there is another side to the argument. When investigators approach him, D'Angelo doesn't cooperate. This is important because it actually happens. Theoretical future betrayal is one thing. Real opportunities are another. The police put pressure on him. He doesn't break, even when he is angry, even when he feels abandoned, even when he has reasons to resent the people around him. He still doesn't cross the line. That fact alone prevents a simple answer. If D'Angelo truly wanted revenge, he had chances. He could have caused enormous damage. Instead, he stays quiet. This is why the question becomes so fascinating. The evidence suggests two completely different conclusions at the same time. The first conclusion is that D'Angelo was never going to flip. He grew up in this world. His mother is deeply connected to the organization. His uncle is Avon Barksdale. The code of silence was practically part of his upbringing. Even when he becomes disillusioned, that conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. People don't abandon lifelong beliefs in a single conversation. The second conclusion is that D'Angelo was slowly moving toward a point where cooperation became possible. Not inevitable, possible. And for Stringer Bell, that distinction doesn't matter. because Stringer isn't trying to predict who D'Angelo is today. He's trying to predict who D'Angelo might become tomorrow. That is where the entire situation changes. Imagine owning a company and discovering that one executive knows every secret the company has ever hidden. Today, that executive says nothing. Tomorrow, maybe he says nothing. Next year, maybe he says everything. The uncertainty becomes the threat. Stringer understands that uncertainty better than almost anyone in the series. One of Stringer's defining traits is that he hates loose ends. He wants systems. He wants predictability. He wants control. D'Angelo represents the exact opposite. He becomes unpredictable, and unpredictable people make Stringer nervous. The biggest mistake viewers sometimes make is assuming Stringer's decision was driven primarily by anger or cruelty. Those things may have played a role, but fear played a much bigger role. Stringer sees warning signs everywhere. D'Angelo rejects the organization. D'Angelo isolates himself. D'Angelo stops believing. D'Angelo starts building an identity separate from the family. None of those actions prove he will cooperate, but together they create a risk profile that keeps growing. From Stringer's perspective, the question is not whether D'Angelo flips next week. The question is whether he might flip someday. And if the answer is maybe, Stringer starts seeing a problem. The tragedy is that D'Angelo's actual goals appear increasingly harmless. He doesn't seem interested in revenge. He doesn't seem interested in helping the police. He doesn't seem interested in destroying Avon. What he wants is distance. He wants out. The cruel irony is that wanting out can be just as threatening as wanting revenge, because once somebody leaves emotionally, nobody knows where they might eventually end up. The organization survives through loyalty, not legal contracts, not written agreements, trust. The moment trust disappears, everything starts looking dangerous. Stringer eventually reaches a point where he no longer trusts D'Angelo. Once that happens, the decision is practically made. The prison murder is often remembered as a cold strategic move, but it is also an admission of weakness. Stringer cannot control D'Angelo anymore. He cannot convince him. He cannot inspire him. He cannot bring him back into the fold. So he chooses the only form of control he still has access to. He removes him. Ironically, that decision reveals how much D'Angelo had already won. Not materially, not physically, spiritually. The organization could control his location, it could control his income, it could control his future, but it could no longer control how he thought. That is what frightened Stringer. Not information, not testimony, not evidence. Independent thought. The man who once accepted the rules was starting to question whether the rules deserved obedience. And history is full of organizations that become terrified when insiders start asking questions. The deeper irony is that Stringer's decision ultimately helps destroy everything he was trying to protect. D'Angelo never actually gets the chance to prove what he would have done. The possibility remains unresolved forever. But the murder creates consequences that are very real. Avon eventually learns the truth. The relationship between Avon and Stringer suffers irreversible damage. The trust holding the leadership together starts collapsing. The secret meant to protect the organization becomes another crack in its foundation. That outcome feels perfectly consistent with The Wire's worldview. Characters spend enormous amounts of energy trying to manage future risks. Sometimes those efforts create larger disasters than the risks themselves. Stringer kills D'Angelo because he fears what might happen. The tragedy is that nobody can ever know if the fear was justified. Maybe D'Angelo would have remained silent forever. Maybe he would have spent the rest of his sentence reading books and trying to become a different person. Maybe he would have walked out one day and completely disappeared from the drug world. Or maybe another year of isolation would have broken the final emotional connection he still had to the organization. Maybe one conversation with investigators would have changed everything. Maybe Stringer correctly identified a threat that was still years away. The show never answers the question because the uncertainty is the point. Real life rarely provides perfect certainty before major decisions. People act based on probabilities, instincts, fears, and incomplete information. That is exactly what Stringer does. If you ask whether D'Angelo was going to flip, the most honest answer is that he probably hadn't decided himself. He was in the middle of a transformation. The man who entered prison and the man who died in prison were not the same person. He had stopped believing in the organization, but he had not yet chosen to actively fight it. He stood somewhere between loyalty and rejection, between silence and cooperation, between family and freedom, and that uncertain middle ground is what made him dangerous. Not because he had already betrayed the Barksdales, because for the first time in his life, he was becoming someone who might. That possibility was enough for Stringer Bell. In his mind, he wasn't killing a witness. He wasn't even killing a traitor. He was killing a question mark. The problem is that once D'Angelo was gone, that question mark never disappeared. It simply moved to Stringer himself. Avon began questioning him. The organization began cracking around him. And eventually the same uncertainty that Stringer feared in D'Angelo became the uncertainty that destroyed Stringer Bell. The man who could not tolerate risk ended up creating the very future he was trying to prevent.